The president of France, Emmanuel Macron, and the EU Commission president, well, they're on an official state visit to Beijing. Reinhard Budokofer joining us right now. He's the chair of the European Parliament's EU-China Committee, and he joins us today from Brussels. We should point out that he was also part of the visit of EU officials to Taiwan, and believe it or not, has since been blacklisted by Beijing. Reinhard, I really appreciate you being here. I think this is an interesting dynamic to see the Taiwanese president making this trip over to North America at a time where we're seeing the French and EU leaders heading off to Beijing. And I guess it raises the question here as to what is the end game here for Xi Jinping, given that he doesn't really seem to have a whole lot of love for the West right now.
Well, thank you for having me, but you're certainly full on the mark. China is not engaged in a love affair with all of us, neither with the US nor with Europe. But still, nobody can ignore China, or would do so at their own peril. And as Washington is focused on China, obviously European leaders also try to come to grips with some of the issues, namely two in particular. One is the war in Ukraine, where European leaders want to warn Xi Jinping against providing lethal aid to the Russians, and second, economic relations, where we have a lot of complaints to grind with the Chinese.
There's been a lot of talk about how do you end the war in Ukraine, and there's been a lot of discussion about the role that China could play, that they have some influence with Putin, with the Russian government here, and we know there's a peace plan out there. Is the peace plan worth anything?
Well, I would question that qualification of China's 12 points. It's not a peace plan. I don't think so. They are not even willing to acknowledge that if they would want to uphold the principles of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, they would squarely have to tell President Putin to get out of Ukraine. As long as they're not willing to return to the respect for the principles of the United Nations Charter, I don't think we should call it a peace plan.
And so, point taken there, and it's interesting if you think about how China has approached this with the U.S., this issue, this war in Ukraine that Russia started. Obviously, you've seen U.S.-China relations really deteriorate. Have things deteriorated when it comes to the Europe-China relationship? Would you go that far as to say that?
Well, certainly. Maybe some of you have heard the speech that was given by President von der Leyen just a few days ago, where she addressed EU-China relations in a very realistic and sober and self-confident way, and did not mince words, did call a spade, talked about how China has, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, substituted reform and opening up by security and control. So clearly, the European leaders increasingly reflect the public opinion in Europe, which is highly critical of the PRC.
Highly critical of that. And so, I mean, what is the end game necessarily? If China's presented a peace plan, which, in your words, is not a peace plan, rather, how does this necessarily end when it comes to the European-China relationship?
President von der Leyen has clearly spelled out that for us in the European Union, China's attitude vis-a-vis the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine will be central in defining our future relationship. Certainly, the Chinese have to understand that if they go beyond where they have been, where they have supported Russia with propaganda, with political support, but if they would go providing lethal aid. That would ruin the relationship completely.
What is the realistic? We only have time for one more question here, Reinhardt, but how realistic is it for some of these Western nations, whether we're talking about the ones in Europe, either in Germany, France, or even in the U.S., to divorce themselves from a country the size of China, economy, I should really point out, the size of China, whether it's from trying to sell goods there or using them as a manufacturing base? I mean, that would be the holy grail, to sort of offshore all that, or bring all that back on shore, but we know that's just not practical.
Right. That's not practical, not from a European point of view, not from an American point of view. You've never heard the AmCham talking about such a thing. So we're not into decoupling, but we are into de-risking. We understand that we have to reduce dependencies that we have allowed to build. Just like we experienced with the Russians when we were overly dependent on their fossil energy supply, we also have to reduce dependencies on China.